Page 66 indeed. Yes, it is page 66. And the upside, I have to be really careful what I say. This happens on a regular basis. So it happened last week again, where I make a comment that we are nearing the end of a chapter, and then everybody thinks we're going to conclude the chapter, and then we get caught up and we have a conversation, and we don't conclude the chapter. So I don't want to make any predictions. That's the safer bet, because then it's rather under promise and over deliver. Page 66. The last piece that we learnt is against this backdrop of a very spiritually advanced kind of person, which we're calling a Beinoni. A Beinoni is somebody who's reached a point where their behavior is meticulous. Not only their behavior, but even the way that they speak is meticulous. You know such people?
Yeah.
Of course, you have to say that you're married to one. That's what you're supposed to do. So, not only is the way that they speak meticulous, but even the way that they think. Okay, now that's a big deal. The way that they think. What do you mean the way that they think? It means that this is a person who does not allow a thought to fester if it's an inappropriate thought. Now that's a really, really big deal, right? And then we said that it's possible that this person, with all of those accolades, with these incredible achievements, it's possible that they actually still haven't served Hashem. And we reacted with tremendous surprise when we heard that. We said, how could you have a person who's at such an elevated state that they're so focused and they're so aligned with what Hashem wants, and they're not serving Hashem? And so the bulk of the chapter said, well, yes, that's possible, because if it's a natural ability that they have, because a person is predisposed or naturally inclined to a particular way of behaving, okay, so then it's not called serving Hashem, then it's called just living your natural self. So my natural self happens to be X, and their natural self happens to be X plus. So fantastic, but it's not called serving Hashem. And that took us to the topic that we left off with last time, which is really the key teaching of this chapter. The difference between 100 and 101. And the principle says that back in the day, all those centuries ago, before people had printed material, so in order, if you wanted to learn something, you had to review the information again and again and again and again and again until eventually it sunk in. Because you couldn't do the lazy thing that we do today, which is to say, I'll check. And by the way, today we're much more lazy than that. It's not like we're going to look on the book, on the shelf. You know, I often have, in fact, I was thinking about it this morning for whatever reason. People come into my house and say, wow, you have a lot of books. Okay, yes. And I'm always dreading the next question. Because the next question is, have you read them all?
Have you?
And the answer is absolutely not. Because there is first and foremost value in having Jewish books in your house, because it creates an environment and an atmosphere, and it keeps you aware of what it is that you're supposed to aspire towards. But in today's world, I fear that people are going to not have books in their house anymore, because you can get everything online. In fact, just earlier today, somebody was saying that they really want to get, there's an iPad that you can get with a whole collection of books, Jewish books, Gemara and the commentaries, and it's all hyperlinked and it's amazing. And they really, really want to get this iPad. And I'm thinking, could you imagine walking into the rabbi's study and he's just got an iPad? There's no books in the backdrop. Like, can you imagine giving a shir and I don't have this backdrop? Imagine instead, very nice. So I'll tell you something funny. When we were in Yeshiva in Israel, there was a fad at that time that you could buy books, and they looked beautiful on the outside, and the name of the book was Chidushei Torah, right? Torah Insights, Torah Innovations. When you opened the book, it was blank notebook. So you could write your own shtick inside there and then put it on the shelf, but externally it looked amazing. So that precipitated a whole conversation amongst the boys. Maybe what you should do, you should get into a business where you paint these 3D shelves. So in other words, you don't have to actually have the books. You just paint something that looks like a depth perception, like a 3D version of the books on your shelf, and then amazing. So the point.
Imagine Shabbos and someone says, Rob, can you look this up?
Can you look this up at Shabbos? Exactly. That's very simple. Rabbis have been dealing with this already for years. The answer is very simple. The answer is, I'll get back to you. Who says I have to answer immediately? I'll get back to you at some point. In any event, so in our world where things are so accessible to the point that you don't even have to think anymore. You don't even have to know where to look. Recently, there's an AI that came out recently that you can put in any topic and it will tell you where in the Rebbe's published talks you can find that topic. It's phenomenal. So you don't have to think anymore. Once upon a time, you have to take the books and you had to look through and you had to page and you had to find the index and whatever the case is. So going back, in the time of the Gemara, they didn't have technology, they didn't have printed books. So how did you learn? You reviewed. You reviewed the information again and again and again and again and again until it stuck. So how many times did that take? How were they trained? 100 times of review. Now again, every time I say it, I can feel the tension build in the room every time I say review 100 times. Everybody's thinking, I could never do that. That sounds terrible. That sounds so burdensome. It sounds so overwhelming. And that was normal. That was considered completely normal. Now imagine you finish 100 times. What are you going to say at the end of the 100 times? You're going to say, Baruch Hashem. Do you remember that really cheesy joke about the guy who hires a horse? And the horse was trained by a Jewish trainer? And it's only got 2 settings to stop and to go. Don't tell me you don't know this. It's like one of the most overused jokes. You don't know it?
I know.
In order to get the horse to go, you have to say, Baruch Hashem. You've never heard this. In order to get the horse to stop, you have to say, Shema Yisrael. Okay, he gets on the horse, and off they go, and it's an amazing thing, and eventually they're at full speed, full gallop, and this horse is now headed directly towards a cliff, and for the life of him, the guy cannot remember what he's supposed to say. And now they're headed straight towards this precipice. He doesn't know what he's supposed to say, and in desperation, just before they get to the edge of the cliff, he screams out, Shema Yisrael! And the horse screeches to a halt right at the edge of the cliff, and he says, Baruch Hashem. Right? So why am I saying that? Because what happens when a person says, Baruch Hashem? After you've reviewed 100 times, again and again and again and again, you say, Baruch Hashem, what is that? What happens next? That's when you fall off the cliff. When you say Baruch Hashem, we say, we're done here. Thank you very much. We've worked, we've achieved, we reached the goal. Now we're good. That's when you fall off the cliff. But if a person returns to that information and reviews it 101 times, they've changed everything. They've changed their perception. They've changed their objectives. They've changed their aspiration. This is no longer simply about me satisfying myself that I know this information. This is about saying, I'm here to do something that's bigger than me. And as long as a person is working to do something that is greater than themselves, then a person is consistently growing and elevating. That's the word. That's where we got up to last time. And so we said that the 101st review has as much value as all the 100 before combined and more. Because that's the threshold. That's where a person shifts. That's where a person goes through the what do they call it in Star Trek? The warp, what's it called?
Yeah, Scotty.
What's it called? I've forgotten what it's called. Anyhow, disappointed that nobody knows the reference of here. Oh, the warp speed. That's what they say. Right. So that's when you hit, exactly, spiritual warp speed. You can travel between universes because you've broken the mold. You've escaped the normality of self, and that allows you to elevate. So when does a person become somebody who serves Hashem? When they do what is not natural. As long as I'm working with the things that I'm good at, that I find easy, I'm not serving anybody. I'm just floating along through life. I'm freewheeling. I'm in neutral. It's when a person does something that is not normal, that is greater than normal, that is more than expected, that you feel the pain, that's when the growth happens. Then we said, so how do you get there? What motivates a person? What possibly motivates a person to push themselves so hard? And we came to the conclusion last time, and this is where we're up to, that a person has to feel love, because when you feel love, then you go the extra mile. And incidentally, it's also related in this week's parasha, because in this week's parasha you see the corollary, which is when a person experiences intense hate, they also behave in a way that's completely beyond the norm, and they do things that they wouldn't ordinarily do. In this week's parasha, it's the villain Bilam, who's this great anti-Semite, the granddaddy of anti-Semites. The person, essentially, I feel that everybody has to learn this parasha. Not just the Jewish community. Everybody has to learn this parasha, because it basically describes what happens when you get so fixated on your hatred of the Jewish people that you can't even stop yourself from destroying yourself. That's basically what the parasha is about. So Rashi makes the comment that Bilam is so fixated, so obsessed with hatred, that he doesn't behave within the norms of society. He does things which are radical. And then Rashi says, but you have to realize that long before there was a Bilam, there was an Avraham. And Avraham also did things that were completely beyond the norm and out of the ordinary and what you wouldn't have expected. Why? Because he was blinded by love of Hashem. So how does a person motivate themselves to go the extra mile? You have to feel a passion. You have to feel a love towards Hashem. How do you get to feel love towards Hashem? It's not a download. It's not something that you can wish into existence. So how does a person get to love Hashem? Anybody remember? I thought everybody was going to say, not only do we remember, but we've been doing this now for a week. So how does a person... Oh, there we go. There you go. Exactly. So how does a person stimulate love of Hashem? You have to spend time contemplating Hashem's greatness. Because the more we contemplate Hashem's greatness, the more we're able to stimulate a sense of love of Hashem. And the exercise that we left off with last week was the trees.
Look out the window.
Right, look out the window and pay attention to the trees and appreciate the complexity of one tiny little facet of life, and then extrapolate out from there and say, well, if that's one tree and the ecosystem that exists around that tree, can you imagine the whole of the physical planet, and then beyond that the solar system, and then our galaxy, and then beyond that the spiritual realms? And Hashem is the cause and creator of all of that, which means all of that is insignificant compared to him. And then suddenly you start to realize that's what's worth valuing, and that's what we should get excited about. And last week we used as an illustration that if somebody would walk into the room and this person was what the world considers a celebrity, which by the way is a funny concept, but that's subject for another conversation. Think about it. Yeah, think of whoever might be the greatest celebrity. I don't know who's considered the greatest celebrity in today's world, but whatever, some A-grade celebrity walks into the room and everybody's falling over their feet and they want autographs in the old days, and nowadays they want selfies. And you go up to this and everybody's chalishing. And you could have somebody in the room who comes from a different culture, and this individual is completely insignificant to them. They don't know what the hoo-ha is about. I don't know if I ever told you the story, but I heard the story firsthand from the person it happened to. That this was a guy, today he's a successful rabbi in the States, but at the time he was a youngster. And as a child, he was once in a shop somewhere in LA. And one of the A-grade actors walked in to the shop. And everybody was like, starstruck and whatever. And this kid was oblivious, completely oblivious. He grew up his whole life in a very frum environment. He had absolutely no idea who this person was. So the person comes over to him and he says, "Hi, my name is Sylvester Stallone." So the kid said, "And my name's Moshe." It meant nothing to him. It meant absolutely nothing to him. So it's fascinating how we could ascribe a value to somebody because of whatever, because they appear on the screen, or because they have a certain success in their life, or they made a lot of money, whatever the case is. So we, go googly over them, and in a different environment, they are absolutely meaningless. Absolutely meaningless. In fact, you don't have to go to a different culture. The same person in the same culture, a few years after the height of their stardom, is absolutely meaningless. You ask kids today about certain names, that perhaps you thought were the big names of the big screen. You ask kids today, I don't know who you're talking about. Does the person, are they a TikTok star? If not, I don't know who they are. You know what I'm saying? It's like a whole different thing. Yet the reality of humans is that if a person walks into the room and they are somebody of greatness, we fall all over them. And yet, we don't consider for a moment that if Hashem came into my space, and Hashem lahavdil is exponentially, infinitely greater than any celebrity that ever was, is, or will be. And Hashem's in our space. It's like you walk into shul. Have you ever walked into shul? Have you ever walked into shul and tried to look at shul through the eyes of somebody who's not Jewish? You've ever tried this? I do it often. And the reason I do it is because people have a bar mitzvah or whatever the case is, and they bring non-Jewish guests, and I always try to think, what are they thinking? And I haven't. They're always the first people. That's true. That's right. They're always the first people. Here before me, it's like embarrassing. And they sit there. They go into one. It's an amazing thing to see. They sit down in one place, and they stay there. The whole thing. They don't. That's it. They sit the whole thing. They don't understand one word of the service for 2.5 hours. They don't know what is flying. They sit there respectfully, quietly. It's a pleasure. So I wonder, what are they?
I watched them on Saturday.
They're right. There was the whole bank of them.
Someone had given them a chumash, and they were obviously going through the English part.
So they were reading. And what are they reading? They're reading, Stone this one. And, I was just trying to imagine what.
And he was smoking the burning
But
bush.
but the thing is, I always try. What do they think? And they walk into a shul. This guy strides in 45 minutes late. Schmoozes with 3 people before he gets to his seat. Then he gets to his seat, sits there for 5 minutes. After 5 minutes, he's already discussing the markets with the guy next to him, joking with the guy behind him. The next thing, they burst out laughing in the middle of shul. What do you think goes through the mind of a non-Jewish person? What is going on over here? Right? So we always say the reason is because we feel at home. And there's truth to that. We feel at home. Going to shul is not like going to an event where you're a guest. It's home. It's Hamish. Sit in shul. Hand out some sweets in the middle of shul. Like, the things are crazy if you think about it. If you look at it objectively, it's insanity. We're going to our holiest place on our holiest day. Would you like a fizzer? Just try and understand what's going on, right? Now imagine if we did this the way that we're meant to, because the Shulchan Aruch says that before you get into shul, you're supposed to pause the amount of time that it takes to walk through a double entrance. Which basically means you're just supposed to ground yourself and focus, and to use an expression that's very popular in today's world, to be mindful. And in many shuls they actually have that, either on the desk that the chazan is davening from, or on the ark. Da lifnei mi ata oimed. Know in front of whom you're standing. It's like a call to decorum. Know where you are. In Yiddish we say that you have to know faverim estate. Who you're standing in front of. Who you're standing in front of. Now imagine if a person didn't just do that and say, okay, listen, this is shul, there should be a protocol, there's a way to behave. Imagine if a person genuinely felt that I'm in Hashem's presence. Just imagine that for a second. Imagine I genuinely felt that I'm in Hashem's presence. How would I behave in shul? I'd be 110% invested in the davening, and nobody would be able to distract me. I'd be laser focused. I'd be completely present. Every fiber of my being, like we say in davening, Kol atzmoisai toimarno Hashem mi kamoicha, that every fiber of my being is supposed to declare Hashem, that there's none as great as you. I'd actually experience that. So that's why it says, if you mizboinen, if you contemplate Hashem's greatness, your whole sentiment changes. You don't feel like you just want to get away with the minimum. You feel like you need to be there and completely invested and running at full power. You might remember this. Some years ago, one of the late members of our shul, some years ago, brought the police commissioner to shul. Does anybody remember that? Do you remember that?
Yeah.
He brought the commissioner of police to shul. It was the funniest thing to see. The commissioner of police walks into shul. Everybody sits up a little straighter. Everybody behaved a little better. I'm thinking, for heaven's sake, you're in a shul speaking to God, and you upgrade for him. I'm sure he's a nice man, if he does great things, if he has an important position in society. But context. So that's where we were last week. We said that a person has to have this meaningful love towards Hashem, and that's the subject that we began last week, that we have to explore further this week, which takes us to the bottom of page 66. And more specifically, let's just get it up here. Don't know what happened to the version that's the online version. That's gone walkies. Disappeared completely. Oh, there it is. Just didn't load. Anyway, so specifically, we are going to the third last line of the page. Page 66, third last line on the page. And over here on screen, it is the last line that we're looking at right now. So, mipnei shekedei lashanos teva haragilus. If a person wants to change the nature of routine. Now, there's two ways to look at that, right? The nature of routine, or the routine of the way we do things naturally. Okay? So that's how we are. We're let's be honest, we're creatures of habit. We develop routines. It's efficient. It helps us be productive citizens. Sometimes you've got to break a habit. Is that right? Sometimes you've got to break a habit. So if a person should in order for a person to change the nature of their routine, so the only way to do that is you have to awaken love towards Hashem. This part we read already last week. And how does a person awaken love towards Hashem? Al yedei shemizboinen bigdulas Hashem. And now, one word we didn't do last week, b'moichoi. So what the person has to do is, the person has to contemplate Hashem's greatness. How do you contemplate? Which part of the physical system, which part of the anatomy do we use to contemplate? B'moichoi, in the brain. No surprises there. But this word is very carefully chosen. The reason he chose the word over here, moichoi, your mind, your intellect, is because he's already introduced us previously to the topic, or to the concept, moyach shalit al halev betul dosoi beteva yetzirosoi, which means that the nature of a human being is that the intellect directs the heart. And that's the fundamental difference between the ability of a human, not necessarily the natural state of a human, but the potential, the ability of a human compared to an animal. Humans can direct emotions, whereas animals have to respond to emotions or to impulses. So let's read a little bit further. Lishloit ala teva shebechol hasmoli hamolei dam nefesh abahamish me'aklipo shemimeno hu hateva. So the whole objective here is to focus our minds so that the mind can overtake the, what he calls, left side of the heart, which is filled with blood of the animal soul, which comes from Klippa. In this one line, the Alter Rebbe has merged information that we have studied in chapters 2 and 6 and 9. It's a whole lot of information that is merged together into one statement. So sometimes you've got to unpack that information, either because we need to review it, or because not everybody was here when we learned it. So let's unpack this information. First of all, we've learned back in chapter 2 that there are two souls. Right? We are a dual soul system. The one soul that we have is called Nefesh HaBahamis, an animal soul. The other soul that we have is called the Nefesh HaLekis, a divine soul. What is an animal soul?
Nefesh?
Elokit.
Elokit, okay.
Right? It's a divine soul. So what is an animal soul? What does it mean, an animal soul? Do we have something against animals? Because when you hear that the other one is a divine soul, it almost gives you the impression like that's the good one and this is the bad one. So do we have something against animals? Do we have an issue? By the way, in Torah language, there is a specific type of animal that is called a behema. And there's another type of an animal that is called a chaya. And then there's another type called a wilde chaya. But, right, what's a behema and what's a chaya? What's the difference? Anybody know?
It's an animal of prey.
No, actually not. A chaya would include animals that are predators, but not only animals that are predators. What they say, a behema is a beast. A beast. Now, seeing as we live where we live in Africa, so we can appreciate that we have a number of animals that we call beasts. Right? We have wildebeests. Right? We have hartebeests. So what's a beast? What's a behema? A behema is generally the animals that tend to be part of human civilization, either farming animals or animals that we use to produce meat, etc. So basically, a behema is typically the more domesticable animal. Livestock, sheep, etc. Correct. And a chaya is generally the kind of animal that only lives in the wild. Of course, people can always capture animals, but typically they live in the wild. So the behema is more domesticable. That already tells you something. We're not calling this the nefesh chaya. We're not saying it's a wild soul. We're saying it's an animal, and if you know how to train it, you could use your animal in a very beneficial way. But by definition, it's an animal. So what do we know about animals? I'll use an example of an animal that is technically a chaya, but it will illustrate the point. Why do people own dogs?
Love.
Exactly. Because the dog, when you come home, never says, "Why were you at the office so late?" Right? The dog never says, the dog never says to you, right? The dog never says to you, "You always buy the same food every single week." Right? Unconditional. Why is that? So how do you say dog in Hebrew? Kelev.
Kelev, like a heart.
So we say more than that. Kol lev. Kol lev. The whole entity is a heart entity. That's what and animals are that way. Animals are built not for seichel. Yes, there are smart animals that exist. But animals are not built for seichel, for intellect. Animals are built for lev. What does lev mean? It could mean impulse, it could mean emotion. So the dog, why do they say dog is a man's best friend? Because the dog, he doesn't have to explain himself to the dog. The dog doesn't want to know what are you thinking and why are you thinking. How was your day? And they're going to give the details. So a man's best friend, it just shows unconditional love. Maybe you have to be a little bit more modern today and say human's best friend. But an animal is not expected to work out intellectually what the better way to live is, the higher way to live is, and modify it. No. An animal is expected to work out what works for me and plan accordingly. So you watch a weaver bird, it's unbelievable what it can achieve, but the bottom line is no weaver bird is ever going to say, "I think we've overdone that tree. We've stripped off too many pieces from that tree. Let's go to a different tree." You might find a pride of lions, the way that they stalk their prey, the strategy is incredible, how they know which way the wind is blowing, how they can identify which is the weakest member of the herd, how they can come and corral the animals into a place, whatever. But a lion is not capable of saying, "You know what, Nebuch, this herd, they lost so many impalas already this year. It must be so difficult for them. We're gonna share the love. We'll go somewhere else. We're gonna shop in a different district." It's not shaykh, not something which is possible. Because the animal is not designed to be an intellectual, objective assessor of realities and then to respond. It is designed to be an impulsive responder to stimuli. So I have a nefesh habamis. There's a part of me that's like that. There's a part of me that if you put chocolate cake down in front of me, it's going to say, "Have a second piece." The dietitian told me I shouldn't have any. Yeah, but this is it. You don't understand. This particular chocolate cake is like no other chocolate cake. This person, their recipe, whatever, there's nothing I could do. So we have a nefesh habahamis, which is an impulsive side of ourselves. Any honest person who looks in the mirror can identify that a big portion of what we choose to do in our lives is driven not by value, but by impulse. We could then train that nefesh habahamis to become a little smarter, a little bit more prudent, and then it will impulsively do things that fit whatever it designed to be, or what it decided to be prudent. So that's the first principle that's in this line that we're learning over here. The second principle that we said is that there's a left and right ventricle of the heart. This is something we spoke about in chapter 9. The left and the right ventricle of the heart is that the anatomy of the heart is that the heart has to be able to absorb deoxygenated blood, and it's got to be able to pump out again oxygenated blood, right? So in order for this to happen, the heart has to be able to, in a sense, be empty to receive blood and then full of blood to pump it out. So the concept of the left ventricle of the heart, that's the chamber that is filled with the blood, pumping out. Blood represents the engagement in the physical world, because blood is what keeps us alive. So it represents the engagement in the physical world, as opposed to the more refined, conceptually, part of the heart, which is open to receive. So where does the nefesh habahamis, the animal soul, link with? The part of the heart that is full of blood, full of passion for life, for stuff, for things, for hedonism, etc. Then we said, the third concept, which we learned in chapter 6, is that this nefesh habahamis lives in a world called klippa. Because in chapter 6 we identified that there are two realities. There's a reality called kedusha, holiness, and there's a reality called klippa, which does not translate as unholiness. How do you translate klippa?
Covering.
A covering, a shell, a peel. Because what it means is, it lives in a world where things are covered, where you can't see the value, where you can't identify the godly potential. Everything is shielded by its external, by the wrapping. So if that's the part of ourselves that's leading life, we're going to gravitate towards things that are not spiritually meaningful. We're going to make decisions on a whim, and we're going to effectively surround ourselves with things that block our view of godliness. That's if we let the nefesh habahamis, the animal soul, lead life, be in the driver's seat. How do we change that? Moyach shalit al halev. That what happens, the brain can control the heart, can rule over the heart. But you've got to get the brain going. It doesn't mean rule over the heart. It means if the brain is clear, if the mind is clear about what is truly valuable, then it's going to nudge the emotions in that direction. Meaning, if I come to appreciate the true value of something, even if it's intangible, even if it's not immediate, even if I have to have delayed gratification, but if I really appreciate that value, then I can direct myself not to run after nonsense. So that's this work that a person has to do to get love towards Hashem. The brain has to go first, because my default setting is love me. Love what makes me feel good. To get to a point of love Hashem and therefore push myself beyond myself, that's going to need a lot of attention, coaching, and guidance from the mind. Let's continue. Shemimena hu hateva. The nature that we speak about, that people have human nature and therefore they behave in a particular way. Where does my nature come from? My animal soul. That's my nature. My neshama I don't need a neshama for nature. I need a neshama to supersede nature, to exceed, to grow. This process of having meaningful contemplation, learning about Hashem's greatness, and then meditating on Hashem's greatness to the extent that it becomes something which is real in our minds, so real that it actually allows us the opportunity to overcome the natural knee-jerk reactions that we have, that is the perfect area of service for a Beinoni. So how did we start our conversation at the beginning of the chapter? We said a Beinoni is a highly elevated person who's really aligned with what Hashem wants, and yet they are possibly serving Hashem or possibly not serving Hashem. Here's how you know. If the person is working to contemplate, to think about Hashem, to deepen their appreciation of God, and thereby redirect their emotions, they're serving Hashem. And if they're not, if they don't have to go through that work, if they're not investing in that focused contemplation, then what? Then they're not serving Hashem, even if they are the holiest Jew you've ever met.
No effort.
No effort.
How can you be holy if you're not serving?
Can you imagine, right? It's a bizarre concept. So what we learned earlier in the chapter is that it is possible that because Hashem gives somebody a gift, and we know this from our own experience, right? Some people are gifted. There's certain issues they just don't have. We had a very interesting experience on Shabbos afternoon. We were talking about the 4 types of people who get angry and don't get angry, whatever the case. Some people have a gift that they just don't get angry so easily. It's a gift. So if a person is that kind of calm, easygoing personality, is that positive? Yes. Did they work? No. So in a similar vein, if a person is endowed with some kind of gift from Hashem, that they just resonate with spirituality and therefore they do what Hashem wants, they are holy, but they actually haven't served. So how do you serve? You've got to now find an arena that is unnatural and uncomfortable and then operate in that arena. Now, at this point, we might panic a little bit. And if you don't panic, that's okay. But you might panic. Say, Oi Gewalt. This contemplation that you're speaking about is, number 1, higher grade. And number 2 is going to take a long time. Nobody turns the ship overnight. Like, even if I was going to start this focused contemplation about Hashem's greatness on a regular basis, it's going to take time until it actually makes me feel differently and then behave differently, and especially fundamentally so. So, am I lost until then? Until I learn this method? Until I master it? Now, he's going to tell us something here in this last bit of this chapter, which will become another entire discussion point from chapters 18 to 25. So this is almost just like a clue to what's to come, but it's a valuable principle that we're going to learn, and you're going to have to hang tight until we get back to chapter 18, get back to this topic. You have an alternative. The alternative is for a person to awaken the concealed love that every Jew has hidden in their heart towards Hashem. Every single Jew. And use that, leverage that love to be able to overcome the natural impulse that we all have, so to speak, in the left side of our heart. So that's, what does that mean? What on earth does that mean? It sounds so abstract. The hidden love towards Hashem that we all have in our heart. I don't even know what you're talking about. Does anybody here feel like I have a hidden love towards Hashem? I don't know. Maybe you do. So what it means is this. And like I say, we're going to discuss this in a lot more detail between chapters 18 and 24, actually. We're going to discuss in a lot more detail. But the principle is, sometimes, and we discussed this briefly before, sometimes you don't realize how much you love someone until you have to separate from them. So it doesn't have to be a dramatic separation, nothing, God forbid, like the end of life. It could just be a person emigrates. Let's use that example. There's nothing like immigration to help us appreciate how much we like that person. Of course, sometimes it's not that way, right? Sometimes it's like bon voyage. You know? But you understand what I'm getting at? In a similar vein, there's a part of ourselves that loves Hashem so deeply, but we don't even know about it until something happens that threatens that connection. And then suddenly we feel, oh my gosh, I love Hashem too much. I can't let go. So a simple example of that, in a very practical, down-to-earth way, is that one of the wonderful things about being a rabbi, I don't know how it is in other places in the world, but certainly here, is at least once a year, usually twice a year, all the kids in the community who are going to university speak to the rabbi. It's a beautiful thing. Like, you might not see or hear from them for whatever period of time, but suddenly everybody comes out of the woodwork. Why? Rabbi, I need a letter. Can you believe it? They scheduled an exam on Yom Tov. You have to write me a letter. You have to write me a letter that I cannot write this exam on Yom Tov. What percentage of those kids do you think keep Yom Tov?
Single figures.
It blows my mind every single time.
I only had one instance with
So-
my son. I think it was on Yom Kippur. They
Okay,
wanted
yes.
them to write. That was a bit
So Yom Kippur, the board of deputies will get involved. And I'm thinking to myself, hang on a second, let's strike a deal here. I'll write you the letter, you come to Shul on Yom Tov.
You said that.
That's to some people I said that. Let's be honest over here. Last Yom Tov wasn't a feature. Next Yom Tov, I don't want to predict. Chances are it's not going to be a feature. This Yom Tov, they put an exam. Suddenly it's Yom Tov. Why? Because sometimes you need a reminder that you actually love Hashem. Sometimes we need a reminder that this is actually what we care about. That would be a symptom of what we call this hidden love. It's not a criticism of the person. The person's not being hypocritical. This is a recognition of what I really care about. I just didn't realize until somebody told me, hey, you might have to come write an exam on this day. Then I suddenly realized I actually care about this. So that's one of the symptoms of what we call Ava Mesuseres. We have this concealed. Why is it concealed? Because I don't feel it on a regular basis. But love of Hashem that I have within myself. If I could find a mechanism to find that love that I already have, even when there's no major issue, that love will give me the impetus to push over the natural way of behaving and to go ahead and do what Hashem wants, even when it's not natural for me.
There's always time, like I always find in life, there's a lot of miracles. I call them miracles, about Hashem's timing of how He orchestrates things. And if you don't wake up to love Hashem in those times...
Agreed. So you're saying correctly that it doesn't always have to be a bad catalyst. Agreed. Could be a positive catalyst. 100% agree with that. Could be a positive catalyst. And Halavayat will always be a positive catalyst. Unfortunately, sometimes it's the opposite. Agree with that 100%.
And sometimes it just feels foreign.
Which part feels
It's
foreign?
like love Hashem.
Oh, to love Hashem, because it's abstract.
Because it's abstract. So it's foreign. It's like you got to really contemplate.
Correct. And that's why it's not so simple, and that's why contemplation is a very long-term process, because essentially what you're doing is you're reframing perspective. Because my perspective is, I'm sure I've told the story before, one year on Yom Kippur, Rabbi Yitzchak Abadichev got up in shul, and he made a whole speech. And basically his speech was, Hashem, we, the assembled, however he said it, we have all sinned. And there was this collective gasp through the shul. This is the last thing you need. Is on Yom Kippur, the rabbi gets up and says, you've been a bad boy. So nobody was sure how to respond. And then Rabbi Yitzchak Abadichev continued and he said, but Hashem, it's because of you that we sinned. So now they were even more afraid. Can you imagine on Yom Kippur you're worried that maybe you've sinned and something's going to happen. Imagine Yom Kippur you start blaming Hashem. So everybody's on tenterhooks. And then he continued, and what he said is very rational. Hashem, if you would have taken Gan Eden and put that on the street, and if you would have taken all the excuses and all the temptations and all the distractions and put them in encyclopedias on the shelf, we would have all done exactly what you wanted. Instead, you put Gan Eden in a book on the shelf, and all of the distractions and temptations you put on the street. So what do you want from us? And that's a reality check. That this is a major reframing to be able to see the world differently. It's not simple. It's not automatic. It's not short-term. It's a huge challenge because it's very abstract for us, and the tangible offerings of the world feel real. So that's what I'm saying. It's going to take a lot of time to get ourselves to have this conscious love of Hashem. That's why he's advising, know that you've got a subconscious love as well. Okay, what am I supposed to do with it? How do I find it? Where do I go? What's the button to push? So he carries on. Because if a person is willing to fight against their natural inclinations, which are usually negative inclinations, and to fight against their nature, how? By awakening this innate love that we have, that would also be considered serving Hashem. Why is it considered serving Hashem? Because it's not natural, because it's not easy. If it were easy, we'd all be doing it. He hasn't yet given us a method, right? He just notes that it's an option to awaken that concealed love. Doesn't give us a method. We'll still learn a method. We're not there yet. But if a person is in a situation that there is absolutely no conflict, no battle, no push to be able to grow, then the fact that buried inside of me I have love of Hashem, that's not my achievement. I didn't put it there. I can't claim the credit for having it, and therefore I haven't yet served Hashem. So if you want to summarize this whole chapter in one line, plain sailing might make you look good, but doesn't achieve anything. Overcoming a personal battle achieves everything, even if it doesn't necessarily look so good. So tachlis, we have to push ourselves a little more than what we feel comfortable doing. And with that, we conclude chapter 15.